Hi, I'm Anna. Welcome to Books on the Go. I'm here with an August wrap up, and I'll just run through the books that I've read. It's not quite the end of August, so I still have, I think, 1 or 2 books left to go that I could finish this week, but I had an opportunity to quickly film a video, so I thought I'd do the wrap up today. The first one is The White Girl by Tony Birch, and I read this with Annie for the podcast. So Tony Birch is an Aboriginal Australian author, and I really loved his short story collection Common People, and this is his latest novel, and I know Jacqueline has raved about it on 6 Minutes for Me. I think she really enjoyed it. It is a good story. It's set in a remote town, or just outside a town in remote outback Australia, and the town isn't named, but it's Odette and her granddaughter Sissy. I'm just thinking back to the names. So Odette, who's raising her granddaughter Sissy, and they're not allowed into the town. So this is set in the 1960s, when it was actually set just before the change in our constitution, and until that change, Aboriginal people were not considered citizens, and they had all sorts of restrictions on their movements, and they couldn't go, for example, travelling without a permit or an exemption, and all sorts of things that just made their day-to-day lives difficult. And Odette and Sissy live just outside this town, but they've sort of settled into a routine, and they are familiar with the police officers in town. And even though obviously they're very much marginalised, they have their day-to-day life is not too affected. But then a new police officer arrives called Lowe, and he makes his intentions clear that he thinks he needs to take care of all the Aboriginal children who live in the area, and that they should be under state care. And so that worries Odette. She also is unwell and needs to travel for medical care. So it ends up that Odette and Sissy have to take a journey, which of course is easier said than done in their circumstances. They're good characters. It's well written. Tony Birch is very good at focusing on characters who aren't normally represented in fictions, and there are a couple of interesting characters. I just didn't love it, and I think the reason was that it didn't feel as if it had an overarching story that kept propelling me forward. It was sort of one thing happened and there might be a problem, but then that problem gets fixed and then we move to the next thing. And it felt more as if Tony Birch wanted to explore these issues of racism in Australia and all these sorts of issues, and that the story sort of fitted in with that rather than the story being the main driver of the book. And I think I probably went in with high expectations because I know Tony Birch's work and he has a great reputation, and he's a great writer. So I possibly expected too much. What Annie and I thought though was that it's an easy, accessible read, and it would be a really good sort of introduction to these issues for, say, high school students or something like that. And that's not to demean the book. I just think that's sort of, it's almost got a YA tone to it, and it is educational. You do rethink what Australia might have been like in the 60s, and I suppose if you read a lot of other Australian books set in that time, they would have a white perspective, and so it does give you it switches your perspective, which we need to do, and was really, was effective. So not a love for me, but also a good read, and perhaps for a different audience. So that's The White Girl by Tony Birch, and we did that I think a week or 2 ago on the podcast. Then we move into Women in Translation Month reads, and I've had quite a binge of Women in Translation this month. I did already talk about Our Worldly Goods by Irene Nemirovsky, which I read I snuck that in at the end of July. I've also read Kim JiYoung, born 1982, by Nam-Joo, translated by Jamie Chang from the Korean. And this was the book that caused such a sensation in Korea. I think it sold millions of copies, or a million copy bestseller, and so it was released in English I think this year, I want to say, and it's a short read, so I think I read it in one sitting. It's a really deceptively simple read but it just has so much in it. And I really loved it. It was a story of a woman who thinks that she's, or takes on the persona of other people, and her husband's quite bemused. But then it goes back into her history and the challenges that she's faced just being an ordinary woman in South Korea. And the interesting thing that the author does is she will talk about the protagonist and say she did this, or then she went to work, but then when she got married and thinking about having children, they had to decide who would go back to work or who might stay home. And she gives you these factual asides, and which could really jolt you out of the story, but for some reason it doesn't here. And I think it's because it's such a friendly tone. And to me, it felt more like when you go to the theatre and you have someone sort of sitting with you who knows a lot more than you do, and just every now and then whispers something or tells you in the intermission all this other stuff that makes it that enriches your experience of the show. So I had that feeling rather than a jarring, which you would expect to have, of factual things being mixed in with the fiction. She just highlights those issues, but it doesn't take you out of the story. So I think I'll almost have to reread it, because we're doing it on the podcast soon. And because I read it in one sitting, I've sort of half forgotten what happened, and I'll have to refresh my memory. But I really enjoyed it. I thought there was a lot in it. I think she wrote it in only 2 months. So sometimes that can be to the detriment of a book. But I think in this case, it really gives it the energy and the verve that it has. And sometimes when writers spend years and years on a novel, it feels like a laborious sort of exercise. And so I liked it. I recommend that one. That's Kim JiYoung, born 1982. Then another Korean novel in translation, Untold Night and Day by Suah, translated by Deborah Smith. And she's a wonderful translator who translated The Vegetarian by Chang and other works. And she also founded Tilted Axis Press, which releases wonderful work in translation, one of which is coming up next. And her translation is worth commenting on because it really is so lucid, and she just finds the perfect words, and it reads perfectly as a work in English, but it still brings the flavour and the culture of the Korean, in this case, language. So I don't know how she manages it, but it really is remarkable, and it makes a difference, I think, to the experience. So this is Untold Night and Day. I didn't know what to expect of the novel. This is about a young woman called Ayami, who's I think about 28, and she works in a theatre in Seoul, which is for the visually impaired. And so she sort of manages it, and they have a small sort of theatre. She has a director, and then it's all managed or funded by this foundation. But then the theatre has to close down. She goes for a walk or goes out to dinner with her director, and also she's taking German lessons. I think it's German, from a woman called Ione. Then it shifts, and this is a really, really excellent novel, and I think she has managed what she's doing really well. And someone described it as a high wire act, and I get that, because it is like because it's shifting reality, and Ayami then becomes someone else, or someone else has the same outfit as her, or whatever it is. It could kind of go off the rails and just jolt you out into make you think, oh, well, this is just a dream. But she just manages, I think, to keep hold of the story and the shifting realities. So it is like a high wire act. And Daisy Johnson described it as a Lynchian triumph, and it does have David Lynch feels. But it's not as grounded. I don't think it's quite as real as, I'm just thinking of Twin Peaks, for example, where it's mainly reality, and then there's these surreal elements that come in. This one it shifts more constantly, and I didn't have a firm footing on what was happening. So, but at the same time, it was really engaging, because each scene is so simply but beautifully told, and has a thought-provoking idea or something like that, that you and almost a tantalizing reference or a motif that you've seen before in the book, and so you're trying to catch hold of where you're at, and you think, well, hang on, those sandals that she's wearing on her feet, there was another character that had those sandals on, or whatever it might be. And so you're trying to kind of keep a grip on it, and I really enjoyed it. It's not an easy read in that sense if you just want to know what's happening, and I still don't quite know what happened. So it's almost one that I'd have to go back and read again, or discuss with someone who does understand it a bit more. But that could be off-putting, but because it was just simply told and interesting and thought-provoking and just beautifully translated, I think it kept me really engaged. So I think it's a really intelligent book. So I really liked it, but I do need to talk about it with someone. So tell me if you've read it, what exactly happened, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. So that's Untold Night and Day by Suah. Then I read one that's been on my shelf and I've been dying to get to it, Every Fire You Tend by Sema, Kaygusuz, and translated by Nicholas Glastonbury. And this one also was quite challenging. So it's written in the second person. It's set in Turkey, or the protagonist lives in modern-day Istanbul, but the setting is also going to Dersim in eastern Anatolia, where there was a massacre of the Alevi Kurds there, and that was in the 1930s, I believe. So based on the author's grandmother's stories, she told lots of stories, but she never talked about that particular event, that massacre. So it was almost, I think, too painful for her to speak about. And there's a lot in this book about speaking and then silence, and when our voices are silenced, or when things are too painful to talk about, and also memory and the importance of memory, or the way we remember things. And so that's a running theme. So based on that, inspired by her grandmother and that story, the story goes back into Islamic mythology, and with characters like Hizir and another one that I've forgotten the name of, with the horns, and all in that region. So there's this sort of mythical, not fairy tale, but a mythical storytelling element, and then the modern day protagonist in Istanbul, who's, I think, a woman. The narrator is speaking to her as you're getting out of bed, or you're doing this, but you still can't, you've been taking photographs, but you're not really participating. And at first I found it hard to connect with the protagonist, because we don't see her, we don't hear from her, we don't really know what's going on. And then going back to the Islamic myths, it's almost a retelling of some of those religious stories, and I'm not familiar with them at all. So I'm coming to them quite new, and it's like reading a foreign language. Of course, it is a foreign language in translation, but it's like when you're translating something in a foreign language, where your brain is working overtime because you have to start almost from the beginning. So whereas if it was retelling religious stories that I've grown up with, I'd already have half the work would have been done, if you know what I mean. So coming to it completely unfamiliar with a lot of the material meant more work for me. And so at first I found it quite hard to engage, because I didn't know the protagonist, I didn't know the stories, and whilst I was wanting to learn more, it was, it made it a bit slower. But then I read this really good review by Books and Bow, which I recommend reading, and I just decided not to worry about what was happening and just enjoy each sort of page. And the writing is so beautiful, and it does have this sort of propulsion to it, and it's really lyrically written and really interesting. And I started Googling, instead of just thinking what's going on, I started Googling these mythical characters, and that was really interesting. And I feel like it's all stuff that I probably should have known anyhow. But I ended up really loving it. And so I recommend it. But again, a bit like Untold Night and Day, I want to discuss it with someone to find out a bit more about it because it was challenging. But I really, I think it is a really beautiful work. So I recommend that one, and especially if you're interested in Turkish literature. That's Every Fire You Tend by Sema Kaygusuz. Next up, Dominicana by Angie, Cruz. So I think context is important here. So this is shortlisted for the Women's Prize, and Annie and I just did it on the podcast, so that will be uploaded soon. The context is important because having just read those two books, which really stretched my brain and were brain benders, this was refreshing, and I absolutely loved the first few chapters because it was Anna, who's a 15-year-old girl in the Dominican Republic, and she gets married off to a much older man and they go to live in New York City. But, you know, Anna is in the Dominican Republic. She does go to New York City. They are in an apartment there, and that is really happening, and I know who they are. So that it was enough for me to sort of enjoy the book for the, you know, initial stages, because I'd come from these twisty dream sequence mind benders. And so I really loved it, found it high energy, very engaging and interesting as well, because you're getting an insight into life as an immigrant in the 1960s in New York. Then it fell a little bit flat sort of in the middle because it was quite episodic. So, and of course Anna is quite trapped in the apartment. She can't speak English. She's got a very difficult marriage and she's limited. She's constrained by not having a job, and her husband encourages her not to leave the apartment. So that, but in its nature, makes for quite a boring story for Anna because she doesn't have much. There's not much going on there, but also just the way it's told, quite episodic. This happened, then that happened. But then it picks up pace, and I did find by the end it was a book that I kept wanting to get back to and finding out what happened. And I really enjoyed the tone and I think the characters were quite nuanced. Her husband, whilst he was a bully, I thought was not completely unsympathetic. He wasn't just a villain, you know, he was someone who was trying to make money, trying to make a go of it in a strange city, sending money home. He had family pressures, and I thought that was well done. And Anna grew as a character, so there is a real arc to her character and to the story. So I really liked it. I think for as far as the Women's Prize shortlist goes, it wouldn't be my pick, but I think it's really well told, good, engaging story, and for me a great sort of fun read after those other two that I'd read. So that's Dominicana. And then I read, and we're doing this soon on the podcast, Summer by Ali Smith. So I don't need to say much about this. It's Ali Smith. It's the seasonal quartet. This is the final installment, and I absolutely loved it. I think it's not perhaps as tight or strong as some of the others in the quartet, but you would expect that because she's written them so quickly, and likewise the editing would have had to have been done very quickly as well. So maybe some scenes could have been 4 pages instead of 5 pages, for example, but that's neither here nor there because her writing is so good. The characters are so warm and wonderful and interesting, and the issues are all in there. They're just, again, it has that wonderful wordplay, the mix of Shakespeare and in this case Charles Dickens, and little extracts from the news, and then art. And so she focuses on a filmmaker called Lorenzo Mazzetti, and it's all interesting, it's all really engaging, and I still have to digest it a bit, so because again I flew through it, so I need to sort of sit down and get my thoughts together for that one. I think we're recording in a week or two to talk about this. So loved it, recommend it, and you won't need me to tell you if you're already reading the seasonal quartet. I'm sure you would have rushed out to get this when it came out. So that's Summer by Ali Smith. And that's it from me. I've got two more that I'm reading at the moment. One is a short story collection by Catherine Mansfield, who's referenced in Summer, and so I thought I'd take the chance to read that, which has been on my shelf for a while. And the other one is Sisters by Daisy Johnson. So I'll report back soon. I'm in the middle of that at the moment. I hope you're well. Let me know what you've been reading, especially if you've read some of those mind benders that I need help with. And I will see you soon. Bye for now.